Young man, if you interrupt this court one more time, I'll have you removed immediately.
Your Honor, I was practicing law. I don't believe this young man understands where he is.
I understand exactly where I am, and I know exactly what—
Young man, you have exactly 30 seconds. Tell this court why I shouldn't remove you.
Because if I'm removed, an innocent man will lose everything today.
Your Honor, this is nothing more than a desperate stunt.
My mother spent 9 years gathering this evidence. She died before she could bring it here. I promised her I would finish what she started.
Your mother's name?
Sarah Walker.
Every mind holds a story. Welcome to Mindfold Stories, because every person has a story, and some stories change the way you see life.
Every secret has a story. Some are waiting to be found. The next truth could change everything. 3 days earlier, would challenge everything they believed about justice. He wasn't there to make history. He was there to keep a promise.
Please, don't let them your mother's work.
I won't. I gave her my word.
For 9 years, David's mother investigated thought she had failed, until her son walked into court carrying the one thing nobody else had, her final notebook.
David Walker had spent most of his life inside court buildings, not because he dreamed of becoming a lawyer, but because he had nowhere else to be. While other children hurried to basketball practice or music lessons, David quietly followed his mother through courthouse hallways, carrying the same worn leather notebook tucked beneath his arm. Sarah never tried to teach him the law. She taught him something far more valuable. She looked down at him and smiled. Don't just hear people, watch them. The truth always leaves fingerprints. David nodded. He never forgot those words. Sarah Walker wasn't a lawyer. She was an investigative journalist. For almost a decade, she chased one story that everyone else had abandoned. Corruption, missing evidence, and one powerful law firm that somehow won every case connected to the investigation. People called her obsessed. She called it unfinished. One evening, while organizing another stack of documents, she looked at David and smiled. People with power aren't dangerous because they're powerful. They're dangerous when nobody questions them. David looked down at the notebook in front of him. So we keep asking. Sarah nodded. We keep asking. Months became years. The case consumed almost everything Sarah owned. She sold her second car. She emptied her savings. Friends stopped calling. Editors stopped returning her emails. But every Thursday night, she still opened another file. David never complained. Instead, he quietly learned how to organize every document exactly the way she liked. One folder, one witness, one date, one truth at a time. Then, everything changed. One rainy Tuesday morning, Sarah received a phone call. She answered without thinking. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, a man's voice whispered, "You were right. They're destroying the original evidence. If you're going to save it, you don't have much time." The line went dead. Sarah grabbed her coat. David was already standing by the front door with the notebook in his hand. He didn't ask where they were going. He already knew. The address led them to a forgotten records warehouse on the edge of Franklin County. The building looked abandoned. Broken windows, rusted security gates, stacks of old government archive boxes waiting to be destroyed. Sarah stepped out of the car and stared at the warehouse. This is it. David looked around the empty parking lot. You think someone called before they got here? Sarah nodded slowly. I think someone finally grew a conscience. She grabbed a flashlight, tucked the worn leather notebook beneath her arm, and hurried toward the entrance. David stayed one step behind her. Neither of them realized someone else had arrived first. Inside, decades of county records stretched from floor to ceiling. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon light. Sarah searched row after row until she suddenly froze. One shelf was completely empty. Fresh scrape marks covered the concrete floor. Someone had removed dozens of boxes only hours earlier. David quietly knelt beside the shelf. His fingers brushed against a single torn evidence label. He held it up. They missed one. Sarah smiled for the first time that day. Sometimes, that's all the truth needs. Sarah slipped the torn label into the notebook. Then she stopped. Every page inside the notebook already contained dates, case numbers, witness names, storage locations, cross-references. David stared at the pages. You already knew these records were here. Sarah closed the notebook. I've known for almost 3 years. I just couldn't prove they still existed. David looked back at the empty shelf. You can now. The drive home was unusually quiet. Halfway across the Jefferson Bridge, Sarah finally spoke. If anything ever happens to me. David looked at her. She kept her eyes on the road. Promise me you won't chase revenge. Chase the truth. David frowned. Why would anything happen to you? Sarah smiled, but it never reached her eyes. Promise me. After a long silence. I promise. Neither of them knew those would become the most important words they would ever share. The next morning, Sarah left home before sunrise. She kissed David on the forehead as he pretended to be asleep. I'll be back before dinner. David smiled without opening his eyes. I'll hold you to that. Sarah laughed softly. You always do. She picked up her satchel, looked once more at the worn leather notebook resting on the dining table, and quietly walked out the front door. David never imagined that would be the last time he would hear her laugh. Dinner came. Then midnight. Sarah never returned. David called her phone again and again. Every call went straight to voicemail. The next afternoon, detectives knocked on his front door. One of them removed his hat before speaking. I'm sorry, David. We found your mother's car abandoned near the county river. They're still searching. The room suddenly felt too quiet. David didn't cry. He simply looked toward the notebook resting on the table. Weeks later, the official investigation stalled. No arrests. No answers. No closure. Friends encouraged David to move on. Lawyers politely declined to review Sarah's files. Even the newspaper that once published her work quietly archived her final investigation. One night, David carried the notebook into his bedroom. He opened the first page. Across the top, written in Sarah's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words. If you're reading this. I couldn't finish. David closed his eyes. Then he turned the page. Every page revealed another piece of the investigation. Interview transcripts, storage references, witness timelines, cross-check dates, handwritten observations. Nothing was sensational. Everything was meticulous. Sarah hadn't written a story. She had built a roadmap. David spent every evening studying it. Slowly, the impossible began to make sense. For the first time, he understood why his mother had never given up. And he knew exactly where he needed to go next. Franklin County Courthouse. 3 days later. Courtroom 4B was standing room only. Word had spread that Harold Jenkins had filed one final emergency motion before beginning the 7th year of a sentence he insisted he never deserved. Television reporters packed the rear benches. Law students lined the walls. Veteran attorneys quietly whispered among themselves. No one was paying attention to the quiet black teenager walking through the front doors, until he walked past the public gallery and took a seat at the defense table. The whispers immediately grew louder. A court clerk hurried toward him. "I'm sorry, son." Family members sit in the gallery. David looked up politely. "I'm not family. I'm appearing before the court." The clerk frowned. "You." Before David could answer, laughter broke out from the prosecution table. The laughter didn't last long. It grew. One attorney leaned back in his chair. "Did somebody lose their intern?" Another chuckled. "I've seen mock trials with older lawyers." Even a few spectators smiled. David didn't react. He simply placed the worn leather notebook on the polished table, folded his hands, and waited. Then Michael Reynolds slowly stood. 30 years inside courtrooms had taught him how to command a room. He looked directly at David. "Young man, this isn't social media. You don't become a lawyer because you're confident. You become one because you've earned the right to stand here." Several people nodded. Even Judge Bennett hadn't entered yet. The room already belonged to Reynolds, or so everyone believed. The courtroom doors swung open. "All rise." Judge Harrison Bennett entered with his usual measured stride. The laughter disappeared instantly. Everyone sat. Judge Bennett adjusted the files before him. His eyes stopped on David. Then they narrowed. "Young man, I don't believe I've seen you in my courtroom before." David stood respectfully. "No, Your Honor." Judge Bennett glanced toward the defense table. "And who exactly are you representing?" "Myself, Your Honor." The judge frowned. "You are not licensed to practice law." "No, sir." "Then why are you sitting at counsel's table?" David rested one hand gently on the worn notebook. "Because nobody else finished what they started." The courtroom exchanged puzzled looks. Judge Bennett leaned forward. "What does that mean?" David met his eyes. "It means the truth has been waiting 7 years for someone willing to finish reading." The courtroom went completely still. For the first time, Judge Bennett looked at the notebook instead of the teenager. Michael Reynolds stood slowly. His voice was calm, almost amused. "Your Honors, this young man is obviously grieving. But grief doesn't create legal standing." He looked toward David with a polite smile that barely concealed his contempt. "I've practiced law for 32 years. I've argued before 3 state Supreme Courts. I've handled over 2,000 hearings." Then he looked back at the judge. "I respectfully ask the court to remove him before this turns into a spectacle." Several attorneys nodded immediately. Judge Bennett looked toward David. "Do you have a legal basis to remain?" David didn't answer. Instead, he quietly slid the notebook across the polished table. Not toward Reynolds, toward the judge. "If you open page 37, I'll answer your question." Reynolds smiled. Confidently, "Your Honor, with respect, we don't conduct hearings based on diaries." David calmly interrupted for the first time. "It's not a diary. It's the investigation your court never received." The smile disappeared from Reynolds' face. Judge Bennett stared at the notebook for several long seconds. Finally, he opened it. Not to page 1, to page 37. The courtroom leaned forward almost in unison. Judge Bennett frowned. There were no dramatic photographs, no hidden confession, no smoking gun. Just one handwritten sentence across the top of the page. Ask why Exhibit 27 arrived 3 days before it officially existed. The judge read it again, slower this time. Then he looked up. Mr. Reynolds. What did she mean by that? For the first time that morning, the veteran attorney didn't answer immediately. Reynolds recovered quickly. It's a misunderstanding. The dates refer to separate filing procedures. David spoke before the judge could respond. Permission to ask one question, Your Honor. Judge Bennett nodded. David looked directly at Reynolds. You personally signed the chain of custody receipt. Didn't you? I did. So you handled Exhibit 27 yourself? Yes. David nodded. And yet, you just told this court you don't know when it entered evidence. The courtroom froze. Reynolds opened his mouth, then stopped. The answer to one question had just created 3 more. Judge Bennett leaned back. Answer the question, Mr. Reynolds. The veteran attorney adjusted his tie. I may have misspoken. David remained perfectly calm. My mother always said, when someone changes an answer, ask what made them change it. Several members of the gallery quietly looked at one another. The judge slowly turned another page. Another handwritten note waited there. Now ask about Box C-114. Judge Bennett looked back toward Reynolds. What is Box C-114? The color drained from the attorney's face. David noticed. So did everyone else. Reynolds cleared his throat. Those records aren't relevant. David answered immediately. They weren't relevant until they disappeared. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Judge Bennett struck the gavel once. Order. Then he looked toward the court clerk. Retrieve every inventory record connected to Box C-114. The clerk hesitated. Your Honors, they've already been removed from county storage. Silence. Judge Bennett slowly lowered the gavel. Removed. By whose authorization? Nobody answered. David quietly looked down at Sarah's notebook. Exactly where she had predicted they would. Michael Reynolds slowly walked away from the prosecution table. For the first time all morning, he approached David. The veteran attorney stopped only a few feet away. You've done your homework. I'll give you that. His voice was calm again. Confident. But there's one problem. He looked directly into David's eyes. You weren't there. You never interviewed those witnesses. You never handled the evidence. You never sat through the original trial. He paused. So everything you've told this court comes from somebody else's notebook. A few jurors exchanged glances. Several spectators nodded. For the first time, David looked vulnerable. Then Reynolds delivered one final blow. Tell this court why anyone should believe a notebook. More than 30 years of courtroom experience. The courtroom became painfully quiet. Every eye turned toward David. David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the notebook to the final section. A folded photograph slipped onto the polished table. Judge Bennett picked it up. It showed Sarah Walker standing outside the county records warehouse. Beside her was Michael Reynolds. The date stamp read, 8 years earlier. The judge looked up. Counsel, were you acquainted with Ms. Walker? Reynolds hesitated. Only professionally. David spoke quietly. My mother wrote something on the back. Judge Bennett turned the photograph over. In Sarah's handwriting were just 9 words. He knows where the missing records are stored. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Reynolds finally found his voice. That note proves nothing. David nodded. I agree. It doesn't. The courtroom looked confused. David continued. My mother never wrote conclusions. She only wrote questions. He pointed toward the photograph. So I'd like to ask one. He looked directly at Reynolds. If you only met her professionally, why were you both at a warehouse that wasn't part of any active court proceeding? The silence was immediate. Judge Bennett slowly lowered the photograph. Answer him. Reynolds opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Judge Bennett leaned forward. His voice was no longer curious. It carried the full weight of the bench. Mr. Reynolds, this court has asked you 3 direct questions. You've answered none of them. He turned toward the bailiff. Bring me the original archive inventory. The bailiff hurried from the courtroom. Minutes passed. Nobody spoke. When he returned, he wasn't alone. Behind him walked the current director of county records, carrying 2 sealed evidence boxes. She stopped in front of the bench. Your Honors, I believe these are what everyone has been looking for. David slowly closed the notebook. He already knew what was inside. The county records director carefully placed both sealed archive boxes on the evidence table. Judge Bennett leaned forward. Have these boxes been opened since they were removed from storage? She shook her head. No, Your Honor. The security seals are exactly as they were when they entered county archives. Judge Bennett nodded toward the bailiff. Break the seals. Every pair of eyes followed the bailiff. The sound of the security tape tearing echoed through the silent courtroom. Inside the first box, hundreds of financial records. Inside the second, original witness statements. The records director reached into the folder and stopped. Your Honors, I believe there's one more item. She slowly removed a thick manila envelope marked Confidential, never filed. A wave of whispers swept across the courtroom. David didn't smile. He simply lowered his eyes. His mother had been right. Judge Bennett opened the envelope himself. Inside was a memorandum prepared 7 years earlier. It summarized discrepancies between witness interviews, financial records, and the prosecution's timeline. At the bottom of the final page, one sentence had been underlined in red. Further review recommended before prosecution proceeds. Judge Bennett looked toward Reynolds. Was this memorandum disclosed? Reynolds swallowed. It was never brought to my attention. The records director quietly cleared her throat. It bears your initials. Every head in the courtroom turned toward Reynolds. The veteran attorney suddenly looked very small. For several long seconds, Judge Bennett said nothing. Then he slowly removed his glasses. In every courtroom, we depend on lawyers to present the truth honestly. He looked directly at Reynolds. When critical information is withheld, the integrity of every verdict is placed at risk. The courtroom was silent. Judge Bennett turned toward Harold Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, this court cannot ignore what has been uncovered today. Harold closed his eyes. He had waited 7 years to hear those words. Judge Bennett raised the gavel. Based upon the newly discovered records, the conviction of Harold Jenkins is hereby vacated. Gasps filled the courtroom. This matter is remanded for immediate review. He struck the gavel once. Mr. Jenkins, you are free to go. Harold couldn't move. The courtroom deputy stepped forward and gently removed the restraints from his wrists. Harold looked at his hands, then toward David. His voice broke. I thought everyone had forgotten me. David shook his head. My mother never did. Harold slowly walked toward David. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Harold wrapped his arms around the teenager. I spent years praying that somebody would listen. David held the embrace. It wasn't me. It was her. He gently lifted the notebook. My mother simply refused to stop asking questions. Judge Bennett quietly stepped down from the bench. He walked across the courtroom himself. The room watched in silence. He stopped in front of David. I never had the privilege of finishing Sarah Walker's work. He carefully placed one hand on the notebook. But today, you helped this court honor it. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun finally broke through the clouds. Reporters rushed toward David with microphones raised. David, how does it feel to expose one of the state's most respected attorneys? David stopped halfway down the courthouse steps. He looked at the notebook, ran his fingers across its worn leather cover, then smiled quietly. I didn't come here to expose anyone. I came here to finish what my mother started. The reporters lowered their microphones. No one asked another question. As David walked away, the crowd instinctively stepped aside. Not because he demanded attention, but because he had earned their respect. Sometimes history isn't changed by the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it's changed by the one person who refuses to stop asking the next question.